afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really pleased to be part of such an interesting event here today. My presentation today is called Stories of Creative Ageing. If I can just start with a little bit about my own story, my own kind of background. I'm a senior researcher with the Faculty of Arts and Creative Technologies at Staffordshire University, and I'm a social gerontologist specialising in research on arts and ageing. As well as my own research, I also have a research development role at the university. So I develop collaborative work with colleagues in different faculties and non-academic partners as well, including helping to develop at the moment a cross-faculty group of researchers in ageing. There's a lot of interesting research on ageing going on at Staffordshire University, and we're trying to kind of bring everybody together to develop new interdisciplinary collaborative bids. I get involved in local sort of community initiatives to do with ageing wherever I can. I'm involved in the Age-Friendly City Steering Group for Stoke-on-Trent, and also in a very exciting initiative which is the brand new Creative Age Festival for Stoke-on-Trent, which should be happening later this year, that we're developing with partners at Keele and the New Vic Theatre. I have a strong interest in creative research methods and in cultural value, but perhaps the most particularly of all that kind of draws all my work together is a very strong interest in stories, in people's narratives, and so that's what I decided to focus my presentation on today. My presentation is going to be in two halves. I thought it'd be a nice opportunity, first of all, to revisit my doctoral research, which was in creative ageing, exploring social capital and arts engagement in later life. I essentially talked to people about their participation in group arts activities throughout their lives, and this is kind of arts as part of people's everyday lives. And for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the life stories of male choristers. I interviewed six men who were involved in a male voice choir as part of my research, and I'm going to present some parts of their stories because I think they highlight some of the findings of the research quite well. Then, in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on a bit more recently, which is a project called And the Doctor Said, which is a very creative and participatory research project where people are telling their stories of healthcare in North Staffordshire. So first of all then, the doctoral research. The aim of the research was to explore the meanings that older people attach to their participation in group arts activities throughout their lives. And I basically asked people to tell me the story of their arts engagement through their lives. It was a qualitative study taking a life course approach, so looking back across people's lives, and influenced by narrative methodology, so as I say, essentially about storytelling. It involved in-depth interviews with 24 participants who were aged 60 to 87, 1/3 male, 2/3 female, and I approached different arts groups in order to recruit participants, so people who are involved in dance, drama, craft groups, art groups, and as I say, choirs, and that's what I'm going to focus on in the presentation today. So, as you might expect when you ask people about their lifetime participation, many people started at the beginning. And there's a quote here from Leonard who said, "I started when I was about 5 in the arts, if you can call singing in the church choir. I was a probationer at 5, you see, and when you start that young, music gets into you, doesn't it?" And this kind of reflected a key research finding was the important roles played by people's childhood experiences at home and school and church in shaping their later life arts engagement. And this was a common finding across all the research. And I think that perhaps home and school you'd expect, although I often reflected that teachers, I think, would sometimes be quite shocked to know the impact of some of either their encouraging words or their discouraging words, sort of some 50 years after they've been spoken. But perhaps the influence of the church is perhaps a distinctive feature for people of this generation, that many people had been involved in church choirs, or also did drama or crafts and things like that at Sunday school as well. So church was quite an important part of people's everyday arts participation. The other thing that's worth mentioning, in particular in relation to the male choristers, is that actually their being in the armed forces had been highly influential as well, that some of them had performed in the RAF or the army, and in some cases would still kind of meet up with ex-colleagues to share stories of those days of performing together. In keeping with this kind of finding, most people's stories of their arts participation followed quite a logical and coherent narrative. Few people had taken up something completely new in later life, and it tended to be a continuation of their earlier activities. Even when people did start something completely new, they tended to explain it in terms of kind of taking after somebody, you know, I'm like my mum like that, or I'm like my dad. So there was still this kind of logical continuation in their story. Another key research finding that kind of follows on from the previous slide in many ways is that later life arts participation can contribute to positive ageing identities. And this was true not just in terms of people's self-identity, but also their social identity, especially when involved in performance activities. So the male voice choir has a certain status attached to it due to its kind of semi-professional nature, and that's reflected in the quote here from Derek, who says, "We have a good time, but our concert coming up, that is the serious one. That is our concert, that is our money earner. So we're taking it extremely seriously." Well, we do take music extremely seriously anyway. In a semi-professional organisation, you've got to have some sort of standard. And other of the male choristers talked about the pride in wearing the uniform and the pride in performing, as well as the actual enjoyment of performing. Like Derek talked about the buzz when he performed, and it took him a while to come down from the kind of the buzz after the concerts. And so new members are encouraged to join the choir, but performances have to conform to a high standard, and members have to treat it as serious leisure. But as well as having the serious semi-professional aspects of participation, there were many, many stories about the high levels of practical and emotional support that people experience through being part of this group, and perhaps something of the sense of kind of family as well. And these were just a couple of the numerous examples of this. Stan in particular was struggling to maintain involvement in the choir. He was talking about it's a real effort now. It's really hard to learn all the words. It's really hard to go out and rehearse twice a week and going to all the concerts and things. So, and I kind of said, well, what is it that keeps you going? Why do you keep doing it even though it's such an effort? What keeps you going? And this was his response. He said comradeship and being together. There's a lot of feeling in the choir. I mean, if anybody's bad, everybody mucks in. They're always there for you. If you wanted anything, they're always there for you. And there's and the other lovely story that's on the slide was from Leonard, who talked about when he was in hospital, and I had 16 or 18 choristers around my bed one afternoon. Now that showed whether they cared, didn't it? Hey, and they all started singing, and I think this evokes this wonderful kind of picture in this hospital ward of Leonard in his bed with 16 choristers all singing around his hospital bed. And I think it touches on what earlier speakers have talked about, that this kind of challenges these kind of these stereotypes of kind of dependency in later life and things, that there is a very strong culture of mutual support and interdependence rather than dependence. And so this led me to kind of thinking about whether there's a distinctive form of community that exists in choirs. And in considering this, I was very struck by this quote from Stan, which very much reminds me of the way that people tend to talk about the communities of days gone by. You know, when people talk about, in the old days, everybody knew everybody else in the street, and that's quite a common kind of thing for people to say. And I think this quote kind of echoes that in many ways. So Stan says, and you know everybody in the choir, and they know you. Yeah, because you stand by them people all the time, you see. Your first tenors, second bass, first bass. I mean, there's 4 of us who always stand together, and you get to know your cordon. And so in thinking about this, I was quite influenced by some previous research on dance groups. And the previous research on dance groups had found that in dance groups, the very act of dancing is like a metaphor for community in itself, because it's the collective act and the collective support and so on. And it struck me that similarly with choirs, the very act of singing, and perhaps especially in the male voice choir, where people are kind of grouped into the parts that they sing, so the choir becomes a metaphor for community itself. And the concept of communitas has also been used in this respect to describe a kind of an intense community spirit that is characterised by social equality and solidarity and togetherness. And I think there was certainly lots of evidence of that in the research. But alongside the positive stories of engagement in a close and supportive community, there also existed threats to involvement in that community, and one of these was the impact of people's health. Now, generally speaking in the research, there were numerous examples of ways in which people's arts participation was a positive strategy for dealing with their health issues. Sometimes, even when people were in extremely poor health and with very limited mobility, they were able to continue to engage in group arts activities, sometimes even taking a role in leading groups and so on, despite serious health issues. However, in some cases, their health became a barrier. And this was the case for Philip, who had very recently stopped attending the choir as he could no longer stand for the performances. He was struggling with a sense of loss, and even returning the uniform, he talked about that being a very difficult and painful thing to do. His story reveals the importance of the choir in his life and clearly illustrates why he was struggling so much with having to give up. This part of his story begins when he retires from a job that he loved, working on airlines, and moved to a new area. So he says, in the meantime, the male voice choir saved me. When I left flying in 1995, there was a very good choir here, and I'd heard them on one of the old 33 Rev vinyl records. I found one track on there that I played over and over and over till midnight, and I thought, oh, I'm going to join that lot. And I had to, and I did, and I stuck with it until this stick. It made my walking difficult, and it really did hurt, and I couldn't really carry it on. But I did nearly 10 years of it, and the taking part was that lovely sound. Oh, it filled the gap of not writing many poems again. But that was basically what it was, and so now I've got the memory of the choir, many friends still in it, and so he continues. Alongside Philip's individual story of having to cease his involvement in the choir, there were more general concerns about the sustainability of a wide range of the activities that people took part in. And this was demonstrated nowhere more strongly than in relation to the male voice choir. So I have a quote here from Derek, who says, the other thing that's affecting the type of stuff that we do in the choir, I suppose, is the fact that many of the absolute stalwarts of the choir are getting on a bit, and some of them have left to go to different areas. They've left because they're too old, or they're now singing in a far better place. You know, they've left us all together. And as I say, this was common in many groups, and there were various reasons why people were concerned about their groups continuing. And you know, and this was really important to people because this was part of kind of value traditions that they'd been part of during their lives. And sometimes it was about the financial sustainability of groups. Other times it was the age and health status of existing members, or the ability to attract group leaders, and also the lack of ongoing interest from younger cohorts. And I think particularly with the male voice choir, you can kind of link this to the changing social norms, that people used to go on to a male voice choir from a church choir, for example, and there were also strong links to local industries, such as coal mining and other industries. But on a more positive note, people acknowledged that quite often people would join as they became older, so they would have people in their 60s who were then joining the male voice choir. And so, which poses quite an interesting question for us all, I think, about our kind of future arts, everyday arts participation, and whether we'll kind of carry on doing just the same things as we do now, or whether that will kind of develop and evolve, and what will our stories of creative ageing be. So I want to move on now to the second project that I wanted to talk about as part of this presentation. The project I wanted to include this project as a contrast to the fairly traditional approach to social research that I did with my PhD research, where I went in as a researcher, gathered people's stories, and then analysed and reframed the stories according to the academic lenses that I was using. Whereas this project that I'm going to talk about, by contrast, is very much about people telling their own stories in creative ways. It was an AHRC project and linked to the Connected Communities programme, and I worked with colleagues at Staffordshire, Keele and Northumbria universities on this project. It's about exploring people's experiences of healthcare in North Staffordshire, historically as well as recently, because the Connected Communities programme is partly about exploring the changing nature of communities. It wasn't, but in doing the research, rather than going in and doing interviews or questionnaires and things, this particular project involved creative writing workshops that were held at various community locations around North Staffordshire. And these workshops were led by writers and actors and storytellers. They weren't just aimed at older people. There were a range of participants a range of ages of people who got involved, but included many older participants. One strand of the project, there was 4 sets of workshops, and one of the sets in particular was aimed at older people as well as younger people. It involved teenage mums and older women who attended workshops that were led by actor and playwright Debbie McAndrew. And in the workshops, the women exchanged stories of health and healthcare. And then the conversation was recorded and transcribed, and then developed. Debbie worked with the groups to develop a 3-act audio documentary from what they had recorded. And the group performed the documentary, it was recorded, and then went onto the project website. And I'll give you the web address in a minute, so that if you want to listen to the documentary, then you'll be able to, along with the other resources on there. Some of the most interesting stories that people were told are around kind of motherhood and giving birth and things, the changes between years ago and more recently. But there were many other stories too. And other workshops resulted in other forms of creative writing, so for example, poems and short stories and so on, about people's experiences. There's a real wealth of creative writing that resulted from the project. There's currently a book in publication, which will be a free book, and that will contain all of the writing that people did. As I say, there's an audio documentary and also project films in which people who wanted to could talk about taking part in the workshops and sharing some of their stories if they wanted to on the films. And all that can be seen on the project website. And we also developed a touring exhibition to go to community venues and with extracts of people's work. And there's some photos there from the launch of the exhibition, which took place at the Burslem School of Art back in December. And I think perhaps the key thing that I learned from this project, and in particular I think perhaps from the exhibition, is the real value as a researcher of taking the stories back to the communities that they came from, and the pride that people had in seeing their stories featured in this high quality exhibition. And it was a real celebratory event where you can see people there have volunteered to read their stories so they could perform their stories to an audience and so on. And I think it was a really positive event. We got lots of positive feedback about the event, and I think people found it a very valuable experience to be able to not just write their stories, but to actually be able to share them in that way. So to finish with, I'd just like to share the key things, the key points that I'd like to make. And I think firstly is the value of storytelling in research with older people, actually in research with anybody, but we're focusing on older people today. And kind of in order to connect people and to convey powerful messages, and often to contribute to social change as well. I think secondly, the exciting potential of creative research methods to enable stories to be told in more participatory and engaging ways, and that by adopting those kind of methods that it actually creates new opportunities for older people to take part in creative activities that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. more generally, it's the potential of arts participation in later life to contribute to positive ageing identities and to develop people's social capital, to develop their connections with other people and the kind of the benefits that result from that. I think fourthly, it's the dynamics of mutual support and reciprocity in the lives of older people that came through so clearly in my research. And I think that, as I said, that very much challenges the discourses of dependency. And I think finally what doing life course research really clearly demonstrates is that old age cannot be viewed in isolation from the rest of the life course. We need to focus on resourceful ageing throughout life. People need to have the opportunity to develop resources, whether that's skills, whether that's social connections, whatever types of resources it is. People need to have the opportunities to develop those resources throughout life in order to draw upon them as they get older. So that would be my final point.
Now over to you. Are there any questions? Yes, there's one over there. And secondly, Professor Siegel.
Thank you, Jackie. That was really interesting. Yeah. Going back to the choir, I'm just wondering, what was the age range of the people that you spoke to? And is it possible, if they were all older people, that there was, for retired people, a sort of sense of community and belonging to this group?
Yes, the age ranges of the choir, the people I spoke to, the youngest was 60, and the oldest, I think, there was 77, I think. And sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Was there a sense of community? Because, you know, there are older people, possibly retired people, and sort of, as you say, reciprocal support for each other in this sort of belonging to this group.
Yeah, I think that there was a very, very strong sense of community, and I think that's what led me to thinking about what is it, you know, what's distinctive about singing together as it kind of brings to that community. And I think that there are a number of different things that I've touched upon there, but I think there are some other elements as well, like the fact that it's an all-male group, I think, is also quite interesting, and also some of the women who were involved in all-female activities also talked about that, so some of the kind of the different dynamics within groups of just men or just women, and I think partly that comes about through some of the kind of the shared histories, like I talked about, the kind of the previous experiences in kind of the armed forces and things. Sometimes it's because they'd known each other for a very long while. I mean, I think that the person who'd been in the choir for longest, it was well over 40 years, I think, that he'd been, you know, so you've got very, very long established friendships, you know, going back a very long time. And as I say, I think it's quite unusual to get kind of all-male interaction, or particularly, I guess, in retirement and different workplaces and things, you might still have that kind of thing, but it's quite rare to have that kind of group.
Professor Siegel, any question?
Thank you. I think that's all very important, stressing the resources that are needed to enable that. In terms of choirs, there's one in London called Sing for Joy that Carol Grimes has, where most of the people are actually in wheelchairs, because that's a choir for people with MS and Parkinson's, and it's quite amazing to listen to them. But of course, you know, they have to keep fundraising for themselves. I also know artists who go into hospices and drawing pictures of the people there, and they're participating in that. And of course, Ruth Ray, that well-known gerontologist, was working on life histories with people in old people's homes. Although she says one thing that I'll just raise, that some of these old people's homes, she said, though, have this ethos that is a sort of extension, apparently, of keeping them all creative, which is really keeping all the old people busy, but not really sort of working on what they might want to be doing. So some of them might actually want to be spending time alone or thinking or listening to music, but there's an ethic to keep them all busy. So that's the only possible, you know, one has to say, when I think about creativity, this is an individual thing that people want to be doing and can enjoy doing. It's not an ethic that can be imposed on them.
No, it's a very interesting point, and I think it comes across quite often in things like, I've had discussions with people about kind of music in care homes and things, and that very often there'll be kind of one CD that gets put on all the time and things, and just because sort of one person likes it or something, and some of the simple ideas like developing individual iPod playlists for different residents, that it actually caters, as you say, it actually caters for so it's not just being creative for the sake of it, that it actually links into people's own interests and likes and so on. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it should certainly take account of what people actually want to do and what their interests are, of course, yeah.
Gentleman up there at the back.
Say that I felt that your presentation resonated very much with my experience. I live in the South Wales Valleys, and the local male voice choir, the Morlice practices in the chapel at the end of my street. And so obviously what you said kind of came home to me, but you made a particular point there about choir perhaps being metaphor for the community. And this is certainly the case in South Wales, and clearly where people work down the pit, you had mutual dependency, you had particular roles and functions within that particular group, and a huge sense of camaraderie. So I suppose my question really is, if choirs are a metaphor for community, and this would be true, I guess, in Stoke and other industrial areas, is it a metaphor for an old community that is now fragmented and rather changed?
I think that's an interesting question. It's a good question. I think that there are different types of choirs, aren't there? I think that choirs have become very popular, and I think that are attracting people from all different ages. But I think that there are particular styles that tend to be more favoured by older people. I think with a male voice choir, I think it's quite unusual to see, certainly in my experience of seeing male voice choirs, it's quite unusual to see very young participants in a male voice choir, and perhaps that's something about the kind of the formality of it, the wearing a uniform, the kind of marching onto the stage and be quite regimented about where you stand and that kind of thing. And I suspect that kind of does attract older participants, and well, that's what you tend to see. And whereas I think that perhaps choirs can still have that strong sense of community, but different styles of choirs would perhaps attract people of different ages, and yeah.
There at the back, Annette, can you just go at the very back, please?
In your talk, and also in talks of a number of other people today, there's been a strong emphasis on arts participation. Although a couple of speakers, including you, have mentioned dance, I'm very much interested in physical activities and participation in physical activities, because I find as I get older, that becomes more and more important to me. Running, cycling, walking. I feel I want to keep that up. There's a personal reason for that, in that my sister, who's 3 years younger than me, has got motor neurone disease, so one sees while one can still move, one should be doing that. Are you aware of any research that I could read, look at, on the importance of physical activity and maintaining that during aging?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head, with that not being my particular research area. I'm sure that there is plenty of research, and other people in the audience might. I don't know whether anybody else is aware of.
Can you take the...
Hello, the scholarship of Emmanuel Toole Winton focuses on physical activity and ageing. So yeah, there is quite a lot.
Yeah, I'd imagine that there would be plenty out there, but it's not my personal area.
And the last, Robin Morton there.
We have some quite strong evidence that physical activity, especially in later life, can have beneficial effects on thinking ability as people age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that is the case, and I'm sure that other people will be able to direct you to the research on that.
Can I add one bit about
briefly, yes, please.
In Holland at the moment, the University of Leiden has started, the geriatricians there have started a project in partnership with a private company to look at vitality and aging. And they get all the different medical specialities that work with the elderly and the private sector involved. And they're going to look at all aspects of aging, but mainly the positive side of it, quite a bit different from here.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
You know, putting the accent on the positivity of aging and positive living in old age.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I just
Yes.
respond to that? I think a particular kind of concept that I like is actually resourceful ageing, because I think that some of the difficulties around positive ageing and successful ageing is that there's the negative side to that. It also implies, well, if you're ageing positively, what does it mean then to age negatively? And if you're ageing successfully, what does it mean to age unsuccessfully? So whereas I think that resourceful ageing has the advantage of the fact that it doesn't imply that kind of judgment that somebody is ageing in a negative kind of way, that people can, that everybody has access to some resources that they can draw upon in later life, and that the emphasis is on developing the resources either individually or within communities. You know, it recognises the role of communities in providing resources for participation, for example. So I quite favour the concept of resourceful ageing. But thank you.
Thank you very much.